Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd, and quick announcement for next week. We have Céline Latulippe, who will be talking about computer tools and creativity. And I think it's interesting because we see a lot of stuff on creativity where the thing you're creating is something like software or graphics or products. She actually works with dancers and artists and theater directors and so on. So it's what we think of as the arts and creativity. So it'll be very interesting to see how she sees computer tools playing a role in that. This week we have Johnny Lee from Google, and he's talking about interface. I was going to point out the yet, but you even made it red, right? Interface devices that have not yet left the lab. But I should say he probably is the leading person anywhere in some interfaces that did leave the lab. He became well known for his work when he was doing his PhD at Carnegie, where he realized that a cheap device, is the Wii, could actually be used in much more interesting ways than what the people who were selling it as a game platform were doing, and that it could be sort of the start for a whole world of do-it-yourselfers coming up with interesting new interface ideas based on that cheap device. So he then went to Microsoft, where he was one of the major contributors to Kinect, which has had that same kind of effect. It takes a new kind of interaction and makes it cheap enough and widespread enough that all of a sudden lots of people in the world can figure out cool things to do with it. So I'm looking forward to hear what the next ones are.
Thanks. Me too. So Scott actually invited me to come give this talk. I gave this at a Web 2.0 conference a few months ago to a bunch of professionals who work in the industry. Most of them are web-based, but I was trying to provide them with some knowledge about, now that I've been inside of two big IT companies, what was my experience like in either working on a high-profile project like Kinect, or what people's ambitions were to do other things like it. So as Terry mentioned, Carnegie Mellon worked on Kinect, but most people know me as the Wiimote guy on YouTube. Still, even. A bunch of people come up to me and it's like, oh, you're that Wiimote guy. And it's like, yeah. And I was like, and I worked on Kinect too. So, what I want to start off with is to say, I want to talk about time. Now, this is a slightly more academic and research community, so you might actually appreciate this. But there's a lot of industrial folks out there that don't actually understand how much time there is between a research project and a proof of concept and an actual shippable commercial product. How many of you know how long it took for the mouse to actually go from lab prototype to market? You guys can't answer it. Okay. So Engelbart did it in 1967, and it was 17 years before it actually shipped in a major consumer product. Multi-touch. Myron Kruger, 1983. There may be prior examples of this, but this is one well-known one. That means it's 24 years before it was introduced in a major consumer product. Gesture interfaces. Richard Bolt, MIT, 30 years before it was actually made a major consumer product. And this is something I don't think a lot of industrial folks appreciate, because they're like, we need to make an iPhone competitor. We need to make something like Kinect. What's the next big thing? I was like, well, you can do something Bill Buxton encourages, was like, look at academic papers 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you might find something interesting that might be relevant today. So the concepts are definitely old. If you at least talk to people who've been doing experimentation in this space, they're like, yeah, you could do that, yeah, you could do this. But what's new about them that actually makes them desirable to a consumer is the timely selection and then execution of the products. So these companies, although they may not have originated the concept to a research community, they did an immaculate job in actually packaging it and building a user experience around it. And I think that's something that the research community also needs, has sometimes an underappreciation of as well. So something around 2005-ish, this is my sort of gross HCI view of the last decade or so, that there was in the early 2000s, there was still a race for the raw computing power. Like who had the fastest laptop, who had the fastest desktop computer, and the megahertz war was still very active. But somewhere around 2005, 2006, we started to actually get computers that were good enough. We didn't actually need too much more computing, and as a result, you can actually afford to make devices for smaller and smaller needs, and interface technology became a product differentiator. Interface designs, sensor technologies, display technologies, or recognition algorithms were sort of defined like what was different about a product that was interesting to a consumer. And let me say that within Microsoft, within Google, and I'm sure within other device companies, there's no shortage of ambition to do interesting stuff here. On a weekly basis, people come up and say, oh, let's do this, let's do that. And then they go, all right. Because everyone wants to be Tom Cruise in Minority Report, or Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek, or Tony Stark, and they want these toys. The companies want to build these things. So where is my flying car? Like, I've heard about these technologies for a long time. Where is it? Why can't I buy it? And this is something that happens in my head when I hear someone say this, such as, take all the people in the world with all these brilliant interface ideas. Only a very small of them are going to see the light of day, which means they have gone past the I've just talked about it stage to an actual prototype stage. Then there's an even smaller number of those which actually reach a meaningful number of developers, not just you and your lab. And then there's a minuscule number of those which will result in wide-scale commercial success. So when people say, why don't we use speech for that? Why don't we use gesture for that? Why don't we use touch for that? You can try, you can build it, but there's a long road before it's actually going to be successful. The products we see now is not the result of a lack of imagination. So why? Why, if there's so much ambition to ship these technologies and consumers' enthusiasm to actually purchase them, why don't we actually have them today? So I want my flying car. So this first part of this talk is actually the top 8 reasons why your great interface technology is probably going to die. And these are basically things I've seen, either why academic projects don't make it into product, why product concepts don't make it into product, and why some products that actually do make it don't end up being very successful. And these are just my top 8 reasons, but I feel like they're actually a pretty good reference list. Number 1, does it work as well as you dreamt it would? There's a lot of people who say, wouldn't it be awesome if this did this? And it's like, okay, well, I don't know because it doesn't exist yet. And I say, well, go build it. And then if you build it, if you can't build it, go find someone who can, and then come back, and then we can actually have a real conversation around it. If the answer is yes, it does work, or it works well enough, continue. Number 2, does it work robustly for enough non-expert users? This is a little bit different from works well enough for users. It's for enough non-expert users. This basically means how many users can you potentially sell it to who will actually pick it up and not get frustrated when you actually use your device. No, but it works well for me. I say, congrats, you can sell 1 unit. Awesome. Yes, or enough people can use it to make money that's interesting. Okay, continue. Can it be manufactured cheaply and reliably and stand up to years of consumer abuse? I can get 2 out of those 3. I say, well, thanks for playing. We sort of need to actually reach all 3 to actually make a real product. If yes, continue. 4. And this one frustrates me as well. But sadly, most normal mortals in the world only check email, send messages, or play games. If it doesn't fundamentally help change one of those or make those experiences better, it's going to be very difficult. No, but it'll let them do something else that's awesome. I say, okay, that's fine, but you first have to convince the world that they want to do that new awesome thing that they don't do now. And that does happen now and then, but it's pretty rare. Otherwise, you can go after a niche market like engineering markets, medical, industrial applications, or other researchers. By the way, other researchers are a terrible consumer base because they're never happy. They always want everything to be different for their own special application. Number 5, does it require an ecosystem assumption like other devices, critical mass, or changes to the infrastructure? Like this has to be installed in the space for it to work. Yes or maybe. Well, this isn't a showstopper, but you should be aware that this either significantly reduces the addressable audience to a point where it may be uninteresting for an execution wing of a product team to actually take it on as a risk, or it significantly increases the overall risk of their project. And they may simply say no because they already have enough risk on their plate and they don't want to add that onto it. 6, no third-party developers are going to write software for your tiny new little platform. And retrofitting old software almost never works. There was actually a period where attempts to do like Connect for all the existing libraries was an interesting effort. Not a good idea. It'll be so awesome that developers will work for no money. And I say, good luck. I will not help you with your project. Or I will write all the software myself, or I will write it, make it irresistibly big to begin with. The platform will be so huge people can't deny it. Some companies can do this. It's a very small number of companies. Does executive leadership see the potential money and believe the organization that it controls can execute it well? Like, if Kellogg wanted to make an iPad competitor, that's a bad idea. But some organizations can do it, and sometimes they can't. Yes, continue. If no, are you really sure there's money? Because sometimes executive leadership is right. If not, then, well, you have your answer. There's no money to actually make. If you still believe it makes money, if you still believe there's a market, you need to find a better salesman or find some other alternative. Salesmen can be frustratingly important for getting projects through. Is it ahead of its time? Some things just are. For example, the mouse was, multi-touch was, and gesture input were all ahead of their time. 1 to 3 decades ahead of their time. If you think it is, I don't know. If you don't know, I don't know either. You can go ahead and give it a go. You'll have an interesting story about how you did X 10 years ago while someone else is now making money when it's relevant. In the meantime, now I will transition to the rest of the presentation, which is I'm going to show you a couple of example projects that I've seen out of research that I think are kind of cool and interesting. If you're familiar with, if you've done a lot of exposure to HCI research, you may have seen some of these. So I may go through these at a very cursory level. But these are just some things I think are cool that we don't have yet. Jun Rikimoto has a bunch of projects that I think are still ahead of their time. We'll see when they become actually relevant. But basically, we currently live in an environment where we have multiple people working with multiple devices, often in shared spaces. And right now, all the devices, what this has is a projector and a camera system on the top. They have these devices you bring in. They have markers on them. You can detect them. The system knows the physical relationship between all of the devices, and you can then move documents in a spatially meaningful way. So our cognitive model about where the displays are is understood by the system. So this is a very simple demonstration of how cursors could actually extend beyond the physical bounds of the device. And this is taking a picture and dragging it onto the screen, collaborative tasks. This was done in 1999, so that's 12 years ago. So maybe 4 or 5 more years, we'll see this as a consumer product.
And Jun led the team that put the first camera in a laptop.
Oh, we did? I didn't know that, actually.
So the first laptop with a camera in it was because of Jun's championing inside Sony.
Nice. That's a good little factoid to remember. Another project of his that I think is imminently relevant now is the fact that you should be able to quickly pass data between devices. I think he used a stylus in this case with a unique ID, and that unique ID gives you a global reference that you could essentially create a global clipboard. And so if you have a cloud-based operating system, you could have everything attached to a simple string ID, and you can move that between devices. This is a project from MSR by Andy Wilson, 2005, the Play Anywhere system. This is basically the idea that if you can create a lunchbox-like device where it contains a projector and camera system so that you can place it on any passive device, a surface like a table, and you can then do an interactive display system in front of it. So this is a prototype, a short throw projector, some wide-angle cameras, infrared cameras so they don't interfere with the projected image, and then he can use it as a touchscreen. So you can combine markers and physical objects, and because it's a camera system, you can do all that recognition. Play together. This is the one I like to show most people who aren't familiar with it, which is, well, if 2 people have it, then they could do collaborative things. So here, there's an example of 2 people playing checkers. They're separated by some infinite internet connection. But there's several $1,000s of technology between these 2 people, but they're just playing checkers. And they don't have to think about the fact that there's a computer, a camera system. They just can engage in the activity in a seamless way. He does some nice tricks where he's doing camera registration. So if you move the checkerboard, it rotates the projection so it still stays registered onto the physical material. Here's one user scenario I think is cute, which is collaborative drawing. So you're working on a document with someone that's far away. You can sit there with real paper and real pens, draw a real picture together. The subtle thing about this is that at the end, you only have half the picture. So there's some technical kinks to work out here.
Pure roller.
When was that?
Pure roller.
Yeah, when?
Early 90s.
Early 90s, late 80s.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm even not doing a proper amount of due diligence on the root of these things, but these are concepts that when I have the opportunity to share, even to product people, it's like, these are some cute ideas that we don't, no consumer product today even resembles these concepts yet. Hiroshi Ishii's Clearboard. So again, sort of this collaborative work environment issue. This was a scenario where you can simulate the idea of working on a shared whiteboard, not side by side, but as if you're working on opposite sides of a piece of glass. So you can preserve eye contact. You can use gaze to direct the opposite person's attention to the work piece that you're interested in. And it just preserves a lot of these social cues, which are really important. And this was done with a rear projected system and a camera that was in line. This one actually did ship on the right side, but there are some more advanced versions of this. This is a medical technology. I feel like consumers will start to get some value out of it. But you combine a non-visible light camera with a projector, align them, and then this basically gives you augmented reality projection. So you can see the veins in someone's hand. You can see the ultrasound projected directly onto the surface the ultrasound's being taken from. So this basically gives a doctor X-ray vision. I think X-ray vision is cool, and consumers would like that too. Some of this is biased because I did a lot of projector work in my thesis, but the Everywhere Displays work at IBM is another interesting project. The nice thing about projection is that you can push pixels onto a distant surface, and so no expensive or fragile technology needs to be at the location of the pixels. And so that means if you put a steerable mirror on a surface, you can then say, I want to display here, I want to display there, and you snap your fingers and all the camera systems work to calibrate, and you have displays anywhere. This is one of the things I did as a demo, which is turning basic cardboard into a touch screen, because I can track the cardboard surface, I can track the pen, and essentially I can take very cheap surfaces and get not quite iPad level experience, but an approximation of it. There actually, even I admit that there are some practical issues with doing this, because the projection technology, unfortunately, is not getting better super fast, at least relative to other display technologies. So when it comes down to where you're going to have projectors mounted in the room, it starts to become a sticky discussion, which is why I haven't really advocated a projector-based product yet. Some of you may be familiar with this project. They had a lot of, Pranav got a lot of attention to this through TED, but this idea of wearable projection and wearable cameras, I think, is a good vision, interesting vision, because you can walk around and augment the environment immediately around you and interact with it. Chris Harrison at CMU recently made an implementation with a Kinect camera and a shoulder-mounted projector, and could create virtual interfaces on his arms and things he picked up. But there's still quite a bit of challenges in trying to make this workable for a consumer product. The end goal that I think a lot of people want to reach is basically this one. This was done just by a guy on YouTube. Whoops, that's not the right app. Who does special effects, but basically this is what the future of video gaming will be like, and let me tell you, there's no shortage of people who would love to be able to ship this product as well. What I love about this is the extension cord, because that's probably going to be accurate. But the full heads-up augmented reality projected environment where you can overlay synthetic material into the real world. There are people excited about trying to make this happen. Now, what I think they miss is that there's still a lot of core enabling technologies that have to be developed before this is realistic. I'll just stop it right there. There's just mostly more gunfighting. But an example of a core tech is actually vision-based visual SLAM. How many of you have heard of visual SLAM? Okay, small number of people. This is something I feel like more HCI people need to know about. Let's see. Basically, this is sort of state-of-the-art circa 2007, so it's 4 years ago. It's basically, if you have a handheld camera and you actually track all the features in that frame, you can then recover not only the pose of the camera in space, but also the geometry of the environment. This is structure from motion. The sort of most popular concept, most visible embodiment of this is photosynth. But there you're taking offline pictures and building offline models. It is actually plausible that in the near term, cell phones could do this in real time. So this is an AR example where he's got little characters in this environment. There's no knowledge about the environment in advance, and simply moving the camera is enough to generate structure. So let me sort of fast forward to some other examples. So this is like a little Darth Vader Ewok example. So he walks up, he gets an initial map by translating the camera just a little bit, and then can overlay synthetic material onto it. So basically, you turn an ordinary RGB camera into a 6-DoF tracker using only software. And that is pretty powerful, in my opinion. There's a lot of technical details like loop closure and recovery and stability issues, but they're all workable if enough applied research is put there. The state of the art as of this year is stuff like this. This is called dense tracking and mapping, which is also just an RGB camera. No Kinect depth camera, no nothing. And he's not just constructing points in the world, but is actually constructing a full depth map. He's doing this in real time on a laptop. And it's just an ordinary RGB camera. So what this will, in theory, allow you to do is hold your cell phone out, hold your tablet out, walk through the environment, and literally capture where you are in that space and the geometry of your environment. This just shows some robustness comparisons between that and PTAM. But one of the interesting things is that once you have all this geometry, you can actually make the synthetic material interact with your environment in a physically plausible way. So it understands all the bumps and wires and curves of the surfaces in the environment. And at the end, he'll try to make the car jump off the ramp. Go, go, go. All right, this is a little slower than I thought it would be. Yeah. Okay. So that's it. Now the interesting thing is that these are not HCI people. They're computer vision guys. So like they're done. Like that's the extent to which they're like, I have my paper, I've demonstrated the paceability. There's an enormous amount of work to make, but you actually still need to be an expert on how to move the camera to make it not break. Now there's plausible ways of extending that tech and extending the algorithm so that a person off the street can then actually pick it up and it's meaningful. And that's kind of where I feel like HCI kind of needs to pick up that ball and say, there's more that needs to be done here before it's actually a usable technology. Some other genres of tech. There's this project I always like to mention, even though I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but they are literally, this is the only truly 3D display I've encountered. They're actually plasmafying air. So they have an array of lasers at the base that are all intersecting, and there's enough energy at a focal point that the molecules of the air burst and create lightning bolts. So the entire thing is going, but you actually have floating pixels, which is pretty neat. There are new examples. They actually had this at CES just a few weeks ago. They now have it encased in water, and they're plasmafying water inside a chamber. So you actually create a volume about this big with 200 by 200 by 200, I think, roughly resolution. If you've seen my Wemo videos, you've probably seen this one. But the idea is basically to provide additional depth by giving computers more information about space. How many of you have seen this video? Oh, okay, only about 30. So let me just run it real quick. First, I'm going to show you what it looks like without it. I can do the narration. So you know, this is a 3D. This is like what a video game is. You see stuff on the screen, but it's rendered in 3D, but it still looks flat, right? It doesn't change. It doesn't respond to how you're looking at the display. So this is simply just doing what's called view-dependent rendering. There's head tracking going on, and you can change the perspective of the content relative to the position of the viewer. And as a result, you get all this motion parallax. And motion parallax is just a really strong cue for depth. Some claim, and I actually agree, that it's a stronger cue for depth than stereo is. And as a result, you can actually retrofit old displays in this manner. You can actually do this with Kinect. I actually built internal demos doing it, but it's up to a game studio to pick it up and say, we can build an experience around it. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm sad when they don't do it, but then they take on that risk of what that entails. There's some of the games actually do have a little bit of head-based camera motion, but not quite filled out to this level of fidelity. How many of you are familiar with the concept of a light field display? Okay, so good. I can teach you a little bit too. So most displays, they're two-dimensional surfaces and they have pixels on them. So each pixel typically looks the same color from any angle. So if a pixel is red, you look at the screen at different angles, they're red at all different angles. What a light field display is actually trying to reconstruct all the paths of light going through that two-dimensional surface. So it's called a light field. And so if it's red in one direction, it's green coming out a different one, blue. So this is as if you were looking through a piece of glass. This is what your window does. It just allows all the rays of light to continue. So this is sometimes called a 4D light field display because you have two dimensions in X and Y, but you also have two dimensions of angular dependency. Now, my Wiimote demo was a rough approximation of a light field display because it's choosing what every pixel looks like from whatever angle it's being viewed at. But really, the holy grail then is to create a light field display which generates the entire, all the vectors of light coming through that surface. And this is a little bit similar to what 3D displays are doing now, where you have a left-right image coming for each eye, and you capture two images. But this is essentially having a different view or a camera for every single pixel, because you must capture the appearance of every pixel from every single angle. And that basically requires capturing these huge arrays of images or huge arrays of projectors, which is the opposite, to actually push light in opposite directions. Lightro is the most common or popular company doing, or at least has gotten the highest consumer awareness for what light field cameras might be able to do. They have somewhat of a pocket-based usage scenario, though it's a precursor to what full-up light field displays and light field cameras might be, something the size of your window or monitor. Another interesting tech to watch out for, this one is actually shipping now. It's a sensor and pixel technology. Samsung is the only manufacturer I'm interacted with about this, but it's in the Microsoft Surface 2, which is they use the same transistor logic that's used to drive the pixels colors, but they have found a way to use that exact same wiring to make each pixel photosensitive as well. So you can place your hand on that surface, and if you have an IR illuminator, you'll get an image of the hand. So this basically creates an imaging surface that's this big, which is very unusual. It's not lensed, so that's an important aspect, which is any ambient light in the environment will expose it like any film exposed would, so you don't actually get a picture if you will without a lens. You only actually get an image of a hand because you're either reflecting or blocking light so close to the pixels. But you could imagine creating a little lens light across every single pixel, and you get basically a camera back that's this big, which is unusual. Other kind of kooky emerging camera tech that I think is worth watching out for. There was some work out of Cornell University called a planar Fourier capture array. And what they did is that they actually put a interference grating directly in front of the low photosensitive pixel. And what that does is that actually creates a lobed response that's relevant. The grating is tuned so it actually interferes with the light coming in. So it actually creates this diffraction response, diffraction grating that interacts with the light, and you get this lobed response at each pixel. And if you have a bunch of these at different angles, you actually directly capture the Fourier components of the image in front of you, and then you invert all those equations and you get an image. The interesting about this is that it's a plausible way to also create a planar camera that doesn't require a lens. There's some limitations to it, but there's some basic science to still continue. But this idea of a planar surface that can capture an image allows you to do things like reduce the thickness of your cell phone or create this entire surface to be light gathering rather than a tiny 1 millimeter squared patch. So as a result, you could turn this entire surface into a light gathering surface, which would, in theory, improve your image quality. Another interesting piece of tech, but as far as I know, this is just a proposal, but it's the quanta image sensor, which is simply doing photon counting rather than exposing a frame. So the way it's very similar to the way your retina works, where you have these sensors that are just firing, and they actually fire in proportion to how much light they're getting. So they're firing faster if it's brighter. As a result, this gives you a bunch of these interesting kind of frameless image capture properties where you can dynamically, you can choose your dynamic range in software and become, I think that's actually one of the major aspects of it is being able to have infinite dynamic range, which means it doesn't oversaturate and it can work for dark images as well. Another emerging area, this one got some attention at CES. This company called Loomis has a wedge optic where you can put a projector down the edge of this piece of glass. It'll internally reflect, but they have this coating on it that as the image internally reflects, the closer pixels start to break their internal reflection limit, and the image actually gets drawn out over the surface. As a result, you can create these transparent displays that actually can be focused on your eye up close. The image quality on this is actually remarkably good. It still looks like these cyborg glasses. So there's some effort there's still some evolution to be done on the optics engine side of this to actually make it more palatable to consumers. Babak Parviz was a researcher at University of Washington who had a microfabrication laboratory actually starting to look at active electronics on the eye, either for display purposes or sensing services purposes. One interesting near-term application might be to actually detect your blood glucose level using the liquid around your eye, which gives you a plausible way of actually doing continuous blood sugar monitoring, which is somewhat of a valuable thing for diabetes treatment. Another piece of display tech, which is also interesting to look at, is some work by Ramesh Raskar at MIT, which is tomographic light field synthesis, which is you look at a light field that's coming through a surface, and then what you do is you create a layered display, which each have its own diffraction grading on it. And when you stack them, they will create the final light field, a final image in each different direction that you want to produce. So you simply choose how many different viewpoints you want to provide at what resolution, and then you can actually create a static display using a layered approach and use masks to create a full image. Now, light field displays are really interesting, but generally the only dynamic ones have looked like this, where you have this gigantic array of projectors and a lenticular surface, or you have a spinning display. This one Sony displayed about 2 years ago. It's actually really impressive because the image quality is remarkably high, but it's a 200 by 200 array of individual LEDs. So they had to actually make a manufacturing process to lay down 200 by 200, thousands and thousands of LEDs in a very tight pitch, spin it, and then send HD video up to it. So that's mostly a lot of brute force mechanical engineering. So there's still an opportunity to look for new optical and display technologies that might make this a little more elegant. Samsung also recently had this little vision video, which was sort of the transparent tablet of the future. It has all these interactions where you're essentially holding up a piece of glass, and you can touch through that piece of glass and pick up things in your environment. This is an exciting vision, but there's a lot of issues in practice. If you actually think about how to make that image look plausibly related to the environment around you, you really need a light field display if you want to be able to hold this display in front of you and actually provide a 3D view that's behind the physical tablet from any angle. You might have these audio stereoscopic displays for portable devices, but you have to hold them in a very specific way. If you want to casually be able to hold it at any angle, you really need a light field display to do that. You also correspondingly then need the light field camera on the other side in order to capture all the light rays which your device is blocking. You also need the tracking technology to know where the objects in front of you are relative to that display, so you can render synthetic material in the proper offset. So if you don't have that, you can do some approximations of that, which is you provide a tablet with a front-facing camera, you do some face tracking, and you can do sort of the monocular light field that I demoed. And then you have a very wide-angle camera on the other side that's capturing enough of the space. So when I hold my device at an angle, it's getting enough of the view in that direction for it to render a perspective correct view in this way. I actually think this is an interesting prototype to try to mock up, and someone might actually try to do it and see how it does in the market. Yeah, it's a one-person experience, but a one-person use case for a mobile device does cover a reasonable number of use cases, so one can argue about how valuable that is. A common component, though, to all of these different technologies, whether it be this display anywhere, these AR experiences of the future, and these multi-device collaborative environments, is a core tracking technology that can actually give the computers information about space. Now, another category of things is input technologies or sensing technologies that I think is worth watching for. Sensitive Objects is one company it's a French company that does acoustic-based fingerprinting for touch. One thing interesting about them is that they don't do time of flight, so it doesn't make any assumptions about the geometry of the object. You can do a vase, I could do this table, and basically what they do is they fingerprint what it sounds like to be touched anywhere. And if you do that at a high enough resolution, you can actually create a touch screen out of them. They actually did have prototypes where you could do dragging and even multi-touch input using acoustics, which I think is pretty remarkable. This is a project out of Intel Research I still really like. I don't know if they're still working on it, but it's the idea of activity recognition in the home. You provide a bracelet that has an RFID reader in this geometry, which is the perfect geometry to read an RFID of an object in your hand. And so simply by wearing this wristband and putting cheap RFID tags in the environment, you can roughly tell what the person has been touching. And if you do recognize those objects, you can do things like kitchen light, refrigerator, bowl, cereal, milk. And what I think is kind of cute that they did with this project is that they did web queries on those words and got back a meta action data point of breakfast. Even though breakfast is not any one of the keywords of the objects, by seeing a correlation of related objects, you can start doing activity recognition pretty robustly. Swardik Patel at University of Washington has this great group at UbiComp group up there that's been exploring lots of these infrastructure-based sensing, so detecting power line noise and detecting water usage, thermal cameras, or HVAC pressure changes. And those simple sensors in the environment can give you a lot of information about what the person's doing, how many people are in the room, who's doing what. Just as an example, people shower differently. And as long as they shower consistently within themselves, you can actually tell who's taking a shower just based off of the water noise. This is a couple of other interesting camera technologies for detecting people. MIT had a nice project where you can actually detect the flushness of your face at a subtle enough level so you can detect heart rate at a distance from a mirror. This one is a project out of Queen's University that I still feel like has some traction in the future at some point, which is eye contact sensing. So when I look at a device, when I look at a TV, it can tell when I'm actually looking directly at that. And for a lot of these focusless inputs mechanisms like speech, being able to direct your speech to a particular individual or a particular device is important. And Siri has made speech a very popular topic recently among companies. Microsoft Research, some colleagues did some work on muscle-based detection. where he had, Scott Saponis was a researcher that did this, where he had a demo with EMG sensors on the forearm, and both forearms, and he could do air Guitar Hero. So he could finger with these by detecting the muscle tension among these different fingers and detecting strums without any devices in your hand. So those are relevant, especially to professional applications where you have doctors or mechanics that have occupied hands or need to stay sterile. They can still interact by doing muscle tension. I did a little bit of work with Desni Tan on brain-computer interfaces, and this is still exciting to some people. It has been less exciting to me, because the short answer is you can't do very much as of now with non-invasive techniques. EMG is a little bit, electromyography, and it's approximately the same thing as holding a microphone up to a computer. You can hear fan noise, you can maybe hear the hard drive, but it's very low bitrate data about very gross activities going on. And it's never going to be a primary input. It might be a secondary input to do contextual knowledge about the state of the user, if they're frustrated, if they're mad, or if they're excited. But actually, it sort of opened up this avenue that we never quite went down. Desni Tan, my former colleague who worked on this, started looking at this a little bit, which is actually treating the entire human body as a sensor for a computer. You know, if you try to create a software algorithm to detect which of these objects is animate, which is alive, which is not, this is very difficult to describe in a computer vision aspect. But our brains are hardwired to respond in a specific way to threats and things that we think might actually bite us or eat us. And so there's a signal in the EMG that you can detect reliably. And so if you actually want to create a software system that can classify images of living objects and non-living objects, one plausible way of doing it is plop a person in front of the computer monitor, hook up some wires up to that brain, and then just flash the images. And now the computer has an automated way to actually classify animate and inanimate objects. Now this might be somewhat distorted in terms of a vision of the future where humans are simply brains of sensors for computers. But there are some nice consumer-driven applications, which is these piloting scenarios or driving scenarios. So say you have a self-driving car or some system, some vehicle that has a lot of capability to either control, prevent, or prepare for an accident. Using a LiDAR system to detect accident is very difficult. But the driver is going to have a tremendous biometric response to danger in front of it. So the car may not know exactly what happened, but it knows something bad is happening. And as well, it can deploy safety systems, maybe active frame rigidity, or airbag systems that might otherwise need more time to deploy. So these are neat. But where are my flying cars? I cannot go to Best Buy and buy any of these things yet. And in the user interface world, when I hear this, it's a little bit, that's essentially the when are we going to replace the mouse and keyboard question. So this is where I take a deep sigh, and I try to explain to whoever's asking the question. And I try to jump into my shortest version of a talk about diversity of interface technologies. And if you look at this graph, as I mentioned, and this is a very familiar graph. It's the computational supply per dollar. But what's not usually on this graph is the capacity of human attention, which hasn't really changed much at all. And in fact, if you look at a modern computer, there's actually very little computer in them left these days. This is the motherboard. This are the input and output surfaces. So the form factor of our devices, even today, is by far dominated by the interface technology. So what has happened with this surplus in computing isn't $10 laptops. What it means is that it becomes commercially viable to make products that are targeted for smaller and smaller use cases. Before, you needed a general purpose computer because they were very expensive. But now you can buy tablet, you can buy phone, you can buy camera, you can buy laptop, you can buy desktop, all at affordable prices for smaller and smaller use cases. And so there is a lot of excitement around the tablet and how successful the tablet's going to be. But when people get overly focused on the tablet, I kind of try to describe this image when I can, which is this is the reality of consumer devices. There's a very continuous spectrum of different form factors and different use cases. And the desktop metaphor, the mouse and keyboard, is really only relevant in this genre, where you're in an ergonomically meaningful space where you can actually reach all the devices in front of you. If you're too small, mice and keyboards don't work. Touch screens are really valuable because they double purpose the surface area. There is a premium of real estate on these devices. And if prior to the adoption of touch screens and phones, you either had to have a bigger keyboard or a bigger display, but not both. And so what a touchscreen does is allow you to dual purpose the surface area. As soon as surface area is no longer a premium, touch is less useful. Similarly, on big TVs, touch is stupid, unless you're doing kiosk and special purpose applications. And so this is where the adoption of motion control and gross gesture control is valuable and has been successful in the consumer space. But gesture control for phones, for something right in front of me that I can touch and hold, is stupid. So that's why these products, motion sensing, camera-based tracking, have been successful in the living room where you have a lot of space. Interestingly, I don't have a lot of good reason for causation, but one interesting observation is that most production happens in this space of devices. And generally, consumption happens at very small devices and very large devices. We can debate for a while on exactly why that might be. I actually don't have a very strong opinion about that I'm willing to sort of stand behind and make super big bets on.
How about cameras? That's usually the small side.
Yeah, so
that red thing is mostly text production, whereas picture production is on the other two ends.
Maybe at this end, production. There's very few TVs. They're starting to. But very few TVs have cameras. Like smart whiteboards?
Right, analog whiteboards. Who cares whether it's pixels or felt?
I see. That's fair. I have no strong disagreement on this one. And camera, someone actually did mention cameras at a previous presentation. I was like, that's fair. Most cameras, you can debate about how much production that really is versus doing photo editing might be considered a more production-oriented environment. But yes, there's exceptions to this rule. But when you talk about different interfaces, there's the mouse and keyboard. But I would say among the devices that we have now, it's already a minority of the devices that we actually use. And they're not going to go away. They're simply going to become a minority, an increasingly small minority of the way we interact with devices. So whether or not it's touch, multi-user sensing, speech, gesture input, camera-based tracking, facial tracking, motion sensing, or these augmented glasses, contact lenses, and body biometric sensing, on-body computing, or brain sensing, they're all different technologies to capture the user's intent. And actually, this is a phrase that I actually don't hear very often in corporate environments, which is interface technology is trying to capture what the user's intent is. It's not necessarily there to be flashy and interesting. The user wants to accomplish something, and they want to use the method of communicating that idea into the device that's as easy and error-free as possible. But just picking a technology like speech or gesture or touch doesn't give you that ability to capture intent for free. When I think about a user experience, I actually think about an equation that's a little bit like this. And I think people get super excited about the possibility of an interface technology working. But then they forget about when it doesn't work. Gesture is cool when you point at something and it reacts, but when you don't point at it and when you point at it and it doesn't react, or it's reacting when you're trying not to interact with it, these are all costs to the user. And I think people overestimate the value of interface technology and undervalue or underestimate the frustration they get when it doesn't happen to work, which basically means the recognition algorithms have to be really spot on, the tracking algorithms have to be spot on. When you think about all the possible user scenarios for whatever device or whatever technology you work on, it's important to remember that there's only going to be a finite set of use cases where what you're working on doesn't suck. A phone is sucky if you're trying to go swimming. A tablet is sucky if you're trying to do video editing. You can do it, it's just not very good. And hopefully the application that you're working toward puts the user somewhere in that good working space, and that they end up in that working space by the end, and the user journey that they take and whatever activity they're trying to perform stays within that good working volume. And this is only done by good design. You don't learn this by checking off boxes on a feature list. You have to sit there with the user, have them use the applications and build the applications and see where they have frustrations and help them avoid the pitfalls or create design choices in the software application to avoid the holes. So this idea of a broad reaching new interface technology that's going to wipe out the mouse and keyboard is a myth. So when people say, when are the mouse and keyboard going to be replaced, I think they're fundamentally asking the wrong question. No, I would say we already are. We're replacing it with touch technology, gesture technology, speech, location and proximity detection, biometric sensing, and passively powered computation, and a ton more. So the future of computing is not going to be a tablet. It's going to be a wide variety of different devices for different use cases. And as a result, we're actually in an era of specialization. So an era of diversification, not convergence. So I often hear the phrase convergence as being a keyword. And people who are overly focused on the mobile phone, there is indeed some sense of egocentric convergence on the mobile device. But everything else is also getting more capability at almost the same rate. So, and good work in this space is only going to be done by good hardware, software, and user experience design that can integrate all the different components toward a particular experience. So, thanks. That's it. Questions? Yeah.
So a lot of the examples here tended to focus on what was possible, the capabilities and limitations of, say, sensing technology to display technologies. Obviously, when you take things to market, a lot of the success rides on its fit for a particular application domain. In a lot of cases, for Connect, that seems to be gaming as the primary starting point. So I want to say, just based on your experiences collecting all these interesting examples, are there any recurring patterns you see in terms of success paths in the respect to the tasks or the domains at which these new devices or technologies are targeted?
I'm going to answer a question in my head that may be related to that, but I don't know if it's going to be exactly that. But there's a lot of filtering that has to go on in choosing what to do. And when I think about Connect, there were 3 different things I thought that aligned to make that possible, which is cheap depth cameras, or a plausible way to make depth cameras at low cost. New computer vision algorithms that were just coming online that seemed plausible. Some of the core work that was enabling was the Microsoft Research Cambridge depth tree-based body part classification, but also market conditions that was good for Xbox to be competitive. Like the Wii would never have been made if the GameCube was doing well. Nintendo had to do something to survive in the market, and they had to do something ambitious, otherwise they were just going to die. And so they did a crazy bet on the Wii and bet on motion gaming big. They were right. The Wii was doing really well relative to the Xbox, and so that made it clear to the execution wing they need to do something to capture that market. And so their conditions were right to actually pursue that. Without those 3 components, the technology, the hardware technology working, the software technology working, and a market to actually buy it, it would not have been successful. And it's also important to note that when people go and buy Connect, they aren't buying cool tech. They're buying Dance Central. They want to stand up and dance like Lady Gaga. So Lady Gaga actually had probably almost as much influence over the success of Connect as the core algorithms team or PrimeSense did. Even today, most of the user experiences, the popular user experience is still Dance Central 2. So being conscious of what a consumer will actually pay for is important for the people working on the core tech, and sometimes not to get overexcited about the tech alone. Yeah.
Maybe one way of reframing what I asked, were people thinking about Lady Gaga or something similar while evaluating depth camera strategies? I don't mean in the specifics, but
yes,
in the big picture.
No. To be honest, there was a lot of happy accidents that came along the way. When there was explorations of the portfolio of the launch experiences, they were really unsure about what was going to work and what wasn't, and only after a little while did the dancing game actually start to shine. There was an early prototype of the dodgeball game, which is in the pack-in title, which is the set of games that come with the box, and it was it's basically this. And to be honest, this can be done using an RGB camera. You don't need a depth camera. There was a lot of uncertainty about, well, the PlayStation Eye did not do well at all, at least not nearly up to the ambitions of what Microsoft wanted to do. So if you could do this with a PlayStation Eye, why is doing this with a depth camera going to be dramatically better? The team that ended up putting together those games, I think, did an excellent job on the packaging and the story. Like it feels like a Saturday morning cartoon when you boot it up. Like the music is there, the characters are there, the sort of adventure theme and earning badges. I think were all important to conveying an experience that younger people could buy into very quickly. And if young kids are jumping around doing this rather than doing this, parents are excited because they're at home, they're safe, they're getting exercise. And all of these factors play into why people actually bought it, all of which are really hard to predict. I'm sure someone predicted it, but you need organizational prediction, and that's somewhat challenging. So there was a lot of hoping and praying and just seeing how good it would be and how people would respond to it. If Don Matrick said, depth cameras are cool because we can make a dance game out of it, I would have been blown away, but I don't think that actually happened. Yeah.
I heard the next version of Windows will have Kinect built in. Can you talk about some of the applications?
Since I haven't been in Microsoft for more than a year now, it would be hard for me to, even if I was there, since it's not launched, I don't think I could actually comment on it. My personal opinion is that the most valuable consumer experience with a depth camera is gaming. I personally like gaming because it is a faster adoption of interface technology than any other genre. And in fact, it's actually a pretty robust industry for pushing computing technology harder than anyone. The graphics card industry was entirely fueled off of the entertainment games industry. And I think interface technology is going to be the same way. I think applying depth cameras to Excel is a little like trying to apply an NVIDIA graphics card to Excel. I mean, maybe there's some things you might be able to do with it, but those applications, those old applications we think about were designed around the mouse and keyboard. And as a result, it is very difficult to retrofit old applications with new interface technology successfully. Yeah.
See a lot of haptics guys in the rooms here. What's your kind of instinct on, and I didn't see any haptic interfaces in your presentation, so what's your kind of instinct on the value of haptic interfaces?
I wish it was better faster. It's heavy, it's high power, it's big, and for most consumer technologies, those are all three bad things. There's certainly industrial and specialized applications like medicine and engineering that could definitely use it. But in the consumer space, the bar is really, really high for actually making an impact. And it needs to be a significantly better experience than you can with alternative ways of providing feedback that's already there. So either using the microphone or using vibration motors. There's a researcher out of Northwestern, Ed Colgate, who's done some nice haptics work on touchscreens with dynamic friction. He actually has a nice little spiel about, I wish I could remember all the parts of it, but the equation for friction has a dynamic friction coefficient, a static friction coefficient, and pressure. And he talks about technologies to change that coefficient on each of those three. And he's like, in hypothesis, and in theory, could combine all three to actually increase the dynamic range. I think that's awesome from a research standpoint, but when I go touch it, I'm like, okay, I can kind of feel it. I have to kind of believe to do it. And that's not a good metric. It has to sort of sell it. It has to be amazing. And only time I've sort of felt like a good haptic system that really blew me away is the mechanically grounded ones where they can push back. The local ones, I don't know what the right term is, but the ones that are not mechanically grounded, I have to believe that it's actually providing me this illusion, this suspension of disbelief. You know, it's this storytelling element that you have in movies, that something is happening that not really is, that's fictional, is the same thing that happens with interface technology. You're trying to sell the idea that this icon or this object has physical bounds, even though it's entirely just bits on a computer. And if the technology, if the input and output interchange is not consistent enough that you don't maintain that suspension of disbelief, then consumers will sort of, it just won't fly. So yeah, I like it, but I wish it was better. I was having this talk with a guy at Disney. Disney is an interesting company because they control the parks, and that means you can control the entire, everything a consumer touches. And we're ruminating about possible ways of doing like this haptic room, and we're like, well, if you could create this gel, which somehow you could crystallize or dynamically create voxels of rigid material, then you could stick your hands in a tub and feel some virtual object. But then that's all just crazy talk. Oh, okay.
Can you comment on the analytics, the data mining techniques that would be a good thing to focus on today for a lot of these? Like I heard that Connect has lots of data mining, kind of traditional data mining algorithms built into look for probabilities and things like that. Where's a good place to focus?
So if I were to run like an HCI program now, developing stuff that I thought students would need to learn, recognition and detection algorithms is something that I think is a little under-focused. And that basically turns into machine learning and statistical analysis about data sets. So if you want to create a good speech recognition algorithm, you need to collect a lot of example data. If you want to create a Wi-Fi indoor localization system, you need to collect a huge data set about Wi-Fi fingerprints, and then you can then mine that data for recognizing where you are. And all of those things are important to computer vision and machine learning. And those are going to be increasingly important aspects to interaction in the consumer space. So I mentioned, speech recognition, gesture recognition, localization. All of those people who are good at all of them, or at least are familiar with working with a lot of them, are very hireable. I'll say all the consumer electronics industries are trying to differentiate on interface technology, and those are the core enabling technologies that actually make it happen. But not only understanding the tech, but also understanding how you use it to drive a user experience. That's actually somewhere I think HCI folks could actually provide a bridge for. Yeah.
Going back to your earlier comment about the kind of unforeseen consequence of the benefit of assistive technology with like dancing and Lady Gaga, do you see or have you heard of any more collaboration with key figures in that role? Kind of analogous to what happened with Beats by Dre, where instead of just sticking Dre on the cover, they actually used it to collaborate with the technology. And that blew up because instead of targeting all types of music, they targeted the type of music that he was known for and he had publicized. Do you see that kind of happen with interface technologies or different things like that? Or have you heard of it?
Yeah, I'm only vaguely familiar with the Beats by Dre history, but that was a very opportunistic collection of a figure that was interested in some core tech and was able to create a brand and create a story that the consumer base could actually buy into. That had a story that hadn't really been told before in that industry, and I think that was really good. That requires an alignment of a lot of different stars to happen, and I think companies would love to be able to create those alignments, but sometimes they force it to happen, and it doesn't always work out. So it's a little bit a luck of the draw and opportunistic. So I think companies would love to do it and try to make it happen more often, but I think there isn't a good strategy about creating an environment which causes more of those to happen yet. But yeah, that was a very successful product that just had a lot of things working in the right way to make that work.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on, I guess, really whether the private sector or basically anybody outside of academia is kind of pushing into, I guess, going back to your presentation, intent research, determining what happens when a human being is actually trying to address a computer or something that they might otherwise consider to be kind of a human being, or if that's mostly something that only academic institutions are doing 15 or 20 years in the past. like before it actually becomes commercially viable.
When you mean intent detection specifically?
Yeah, like intent detection, but with regard to kind of like everything that you talked about up until now, because we can use eye contact recognition or body motion or anything else like that to determine intent, or to intuit intent, I suppose. But I was wondering if you could comment on whether, I guess, companies like Google or Microsoft or anybody else is going into actual research on that topic.
I know for sure MSR has a few people that explore in that space. I actually don't know the portfolio of work going on in Google Research very well. Part of it is that hasn't, in order to make products show up on the shelves that do something, the product wings have to get excited about an idea enough to take on that risk. And this idea of understanding the user's intent is new. It hasn't quite been pulled into the vernacular yet. And I think sometimes the academic work goes a little bit too far off the end, and you can start creating like these conversational agents embodied in various different forms, but it's really hard to see how that turns into Siri. Right, or it can be. So Siri is one example, I think, that seemed to raise a bunch of these ideas into the mind of product leaders, because it's not just a speech recognition system. The Android platform had speech recognition on it before. Siri has an integration into its OS, into the OS, that allows you to actually understand, try to maintain the state of the user and understand what the user is trying to get at. And it pulls together more than what you just said, the last few words you just said. And I think that level of understanding is relatively new to the consumer space, but it's important to see where that works and where it doesn't work. Like I like robotics research, for example, and it's like HRI, human robotics interface stuff, I think some of it is just ahead of its time, in my opinion. It's just like the technology that they're working with and the platform they're working with is not large enough to be relevant to enough people. And so if you can apply that same mentality but sort of scope it around what consumer technologies could do soonish, then it becomes much more relevant to the conversation. But it's still new. I don't know of any particular people I think are hitting it spot on. The speech people are the furthest along, simply because in natural language understanding you have to start modeling that. It shows up in gesture. It conceptually shows up in more sophisticated gesture-based interaction, but sometimes gesture and speech start to overlap, and sometimes they're coupled. And so I have yet to see any real research combining both speech and gesture together to do intent communication to a computer. Usually it's speech only or gesture only. And yeah.
Except for bold.
Yeah.
Put that there.
Yeah, right. Put that there. I mean, it's like that old simple idea still hasn't quite made it in the product yet. But yeah, so speech and gesture have a nice synthesis in terms of spatial and temporal signatures.
Okay.
One over there. You want to do one more?
They made a great point about not being able to do power using on an iPad, such as video editing. So I'm curious what your opinion is on where we're going to be going and replacing the mouse and keyboard for the power user. Do you think it's going to be in biometric bands? Or also is it just going to be whoever backs what and will rise to the top if you get Lady Gaga on board, basically?
There's like an unusual gravity, just simply because of the pop success of the iPad. There's money to be made there there's money to be made by moving off poor slate experiences onto the iPad. Can still make some money because there's just so much volume there that you can still sell software units. But the power user is always going to want the best tools to accomplish their task, and unfortunately that becomes very disparate very quickly. Even high-end video editors will have their video editing station, and audio mixers will have their audio mixing station, and 3D modelers will have all their 6-off input tools. They're going to be smaller volume, they're going to be higher price point just due to their volume, but it becomes cheaper and cheaper to make more specialized devices. So these expert users can buy tools for a particular need. And that's probably going to become more and more diverse and more common. Yeah, that's my opinion. Like I saw this great little 6-off input device at CES this year. It's $1,000, but it's the best desktop 6-off input pen I've seen. I was like, wow, okay, that's much cheaper than any other 6-off tracking system I've seen in that space. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.